Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second session of the Toxic Fire Environment, Giving the All Clear. We had our first session that ran from 1:30 till 3, so this is the second one. Looking around the room, I originally saw the registration. There were like 135, 140 people registered for the second session. I don't know where they are, but I know they're missing. But we have 4 speakers today. My name is Brian Moore. I'm a fire captain paramedic for the Phoenix Fire Department. I'm also an executive board member of United Phoenix Firefighters Local 493. In that role, I assist members with worker compensation claim, pension-related issues, deferred comp 457 program, healthcare task force, healthcare plan design issues, as well as assisting members that are diagnosed with cancer and assisting with the cancer presumption law. So I'm going to give a perspective on that and some of the things we do for exposure protection here, the last part of this presentation. But the first 3 speakers will present some scientific information on the toxic fire environment, some of the hazards that, that exist that you may all well be aware of. Just a show of hands here, how many of you attended the NIOSH presentation this morning? Good, it was a good presentation. How many of you attended twice? I went twice because there was so much good information that I couldn't really process it all the first time that I sat through the second one. So there'll be some really detailed NIOSH information that will also, additionally, validate and improve upon the master study that was done in 2006. So that should be published here in the near future. But for our presentation today, the first person I'm going to introduce for her presentation is Cheryl Patton of the Commonwealth Biomonitoring Resource Center, and she has some detailed information on exposures and cancer-causing agents that we all experience on a regular basis as firefighters. So, Cheryl?
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to put a watch up here so I don't speak over, so we don't get cut short. I do have a handout, so maybe afterwards, if you're interested, you can come and pick one up. My name is Cheryl Patton. I work in a nonprofit agency called Commonwealth that works with people with cancer. We work with people to try to help them learn how to become healthy cancer patients and make the kind of choices that will really support their health while they go through the process of having cancer. Could have to do with diet, with meditation, whatever that is important to that person, how they make decisions is completely supported, including discussions about what kind of chemotherapy you want to use, including discussions about death and dying. And we have just been awarded, because I do biomonitoring with communities of concern, a grant from the California Breast Cancer Research Program to biomonitor 80 women firefighters in San Francisco Bay Area, along with 80 controls for targeted chemicals of concern related to firefighting, look at them for some of the risk factors related to breast cancer. And also we're going to do time of flight monitoring, which is a technique this CDC, Centers for Disease Control, is teaching to some labs in certain states, which allows us to biomonitor for more than 5,000 chemical substances at a time, which means that I think we may come up with some interesting results showing chemical exposures to some substances that have not yet been studied with firefighters. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about biomonitoring, what it means, what we've learned from it so far, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about 2 classes of chemicals, not necessarily the worst ones out there, but they're just kind of samples of chemicals and how we can deal with them. Some can be regulated, some cannot. So biomonitoring is an assessment of human exposures to environmental chemicals. That basically means man-made chemicals, chemicals used in industrial processes, using body fluids and sometimes tissues. And when you get biomonitored, what you're getting is a snapshot in time of what you're exposed, what your body is carrying in terms of chemical substances at that moment. So for firefighters, your biomonitoring results can show what you've been exposed to on the fire ground, both in recent exposures and long-term exposure. So in a sense, your body will carry a record of how building materials may perhaps have been changed throughout the past 20 or 30 years. If you're biomonitored for example, benzene, toluene, xylene, these kind of chemicals you might encounter on the fire ground, those will go through your body really quickly, maybe 24 hours. So to pick those up in any kind of biomonitoring study, your biospecimen has to be sampled within 24 hours after exposure to be tested later on. However, if you've been exposed to polybrominated diphenyl ethers or dioxin, those are the kind of chemicals that last in your body months, weeks, maybe decades, depending on your rate of metabolism. So those are going to show up in your body, and they may be from recent exposures. They can be from exposures 10 years ago. So anyway, your body kind of carries that kind of record. And trying to assess the information about biomonitoring tends to be complicated. People often look at their biomonitoring readouts. It's always a sobering moment, I found, because to read the studies and know you're exposed is one thing, but to see it, actual proof, ultimate proof that you're carrying a chemical, you've been exposed to a chemical by looking at your body, is actually sobering. It's something to learn to live with, and when we talk to people about being biomonitored, we have to tell them, this is information, you can't forget this information. It puts a little bit of pressure on you. So it's something to always to think about before you agree to be biomonitored. But when people want to look at their results, they tend to look at maybe a small level exposure and think they're home free. No problem, small level of exposure. Or they'll look at high level exposure and get worried. Does it really work that way? Everybody's body is somewhat different, and how your body is going to react to a toxic chemical is going to be moderated by a number of factors. Basically, one is your basic good health, resilience. Are you getting good exercise, good nutrition? Do you have good genetic inheritance from your parents? That's going to help you withstand effects of toxic chemicals. Whereas stress is going to make it a little more difficult. We know that you're exposed to lots of chemicals, mixtures of chemicals, time and time and time again. That is going to make it a little more difficult for your family to withstand the effects of toxic chemicals. There's other kinds of combinations about toxic chemicals. For example, viruses. If you're exposed to Epstein-Barr virus, for example, your chances of getting non-Hodgkin's lymphoma increases slightly. If you're exposed to high levels of PCBs, which are now banned, but it's a kind of chemical that lasts forever, it's out there in the environment, high levels of exposure to that, your chance of getting non-Hodgkin's lymphoma also increases. But exposed to those two together, your chances of getting non-Hodgkin's lymphoma increases by about 20-fold. So there's that strange kind of combination of chemicals with viruses or other infectious diseases that can modify the toxicity of a chemical. So all that is kind of personal information that when you're counseled after being biomonitored, you need to talk to a health professional what all that really means. So the CDC biomonitoring program is the gold standard for monitoring. It's a program that monitors average Americans for levels of exposure. They've been putting out reports every 2 years. You can go online and look at what the average levels of exposures are in the United States. And it's a way for us to look at, see what people are being exposed to out there. It helps us define further areas of research, and it can act as kind of a control group. If this is the average exposure to a chemical, then any kind of study we do that's elevated to that is a cause for concern. But having these average numbers of chemicals in your body doesn't necessarily mean it's normal. Many of these chemicals being tested for didn't exist, say, in the 1930s. Your grandparents were exposed to these, but we are now. Okay, and one research project that came from looking at CDC data is this fairly complicated slide that looked at the serum of pregnant women and urine data to see how many women, percentage of U.S. pregnant women, because this study is considered to be representative of all U.S. citizens, were carrying toxic chemicals in their bodies. And they're looking at chemicals that are found in everyday products, chemicals that we now know could be harmful, because the information about harm has come after these were introduced on markets, there's been a bit of a struggle to get substitutes for these chemicals taken out, put in these products and the harmful ones taken out. Something like frying pans can have stain-resistant chemicals called PFCs, which incidentally firefighters are exposed to. They're stain-resistant waterproofing materials. They're also found apparently in some firefighting foam for gasoline fires. You will probably have PFCs if we were to biomonitor you, and they are related to cardiovascular disease. So PFCs, other chemicals, DDT is in there, some of the flame retardants, bisphenol A, which is related to a variety of diseases. But what this picture tells us that I wanted to point out is two things. It kind of indicates that we all are indeed carrying hundreds of chemicals in our bodies, many of which that have not been tested for their safety. And my colleague Kathy Curtis later will tell you just why the chemical policy is what it is in the United States and how we can work to change that. The other thing I want you to know is that some of these chemicals are harmful at small doses. Now, we usually think the dose makes the poison, and that's certainly true, but it's also true that timing of exposure can make small levels of chemicals also harmful. So if a pregnant woman is carrying some of these chemicals in her body, these chemicals can cross the placental barrier and affect the development of a growing fetus. By going into the tissues and fluids of that developing fetus. The cells are rapidly proliferating, they're deciding what they're going to be, and a little chemical that goes in there and looks like a hormone can disrupt that whole process and harm developing neurological, reproductive, and immunological systems. And that whole thing is called endocrine disruption chemicals. This is what the endocrine system is. It relates metabolism, immune reproduction, and so on. Here are the list of the hormones that are part of the endocrine system. A lot of chemicals we're exposed to, apparently these days, can look like some of these hormones to our bodies and cause things to happen that shouldn't happen. For a child, a developing fetus, it tends to be more serious because they're growing. But there are some effects for adults as well, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. So once again, endocrine disruptors are mistakenly recognized as hormones, and they can initiate a cascade of not great effects. Some of the chemicals are DDT, bisphenol A, phthalates, PBDs, pesticides, and so on. Organotin compounds is something we're all exposed to. It's used in spackle and vinyl flooring, solvents, paints, things like that. In animal studies, it's been associated with obesity in animal studies because it causes cells that are differentiating to think that they are supposed to become fat cells rather than bone cells. So if you're exposed in utero or young to these organotins, you will have a propensity to grow up and to be a fairly chubby person, and you may have soft bones. If what we're finding out from animal studies also applies to humans. There are other chemicals associated with obesity, diabetes, what we call metabolic syndrome. Okay, so you all are very much more familiar with this than I am, all the sources of exposure to a firefighter, to toxic chemicals, different kinds of pathways, and other speakers are going to address this a little bit more in depth. Want to point out that some of the chemicals you're exposed to the fire ground, you may also be exposed to at home. We'll talk a little bit about that. But you may be exposed to them at greater amounts while in the firefighting. One thing that I pulled the slide out for, in particular, is that I took a firefighter turnout suit to the California Environmental Health Monitoring Lab and just said, what's in this suit? Is there something in there here we might need to be concerned about? And yes, along the hem of the pant leg down at the bottom, there are flame retardants in there because we could detect levels of bromine and chlorine, which are chemicals that are used in the polybrominated diphenyl ethers. Now, you don't want your pants bottoms to catch on fire, so it's a good thing to have that. I'm not sure there was enough flame retardants in it to make that actually effective, but I do know when PBDEs, this kind of flame retardant, when they heat up or burn, they produce dioxins and furans, which are very powerful carcinogens. So is that what you want in your pants? Do you want that being heating up and then exposing you to dioxins, which take up residence in your body for a long time? There might be a safer way to do that. Also, inside the coat itself, there was kind of a cotton lining, kind of a cotton quilted vest, and on the inside of that, we also detected evidence that there were flame retardants inside this coat. So that means right inside you also be exposed to PBDEs. PBDs are not molecularly bound to the materials they're put into as flame retardants, so they will leach out and get into household dust and so on. And so they are probably leaching out and getting into firefighters, dermal exposure, whatever. Something to think about. I think more research should be done there. You've all heard a lot about the health and the exposures to the firefighters at 9/11. I just picked out one chemical to talk about, a set of chemicals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which you're exposed to when combustion is incomplete. And we're all exposed to PAHs on a regular basis. If you're stuck in traffic with the window down, they'll go into your body. Gas-powered lawnmower, same thing. Grilling food, if you eat vegetables that are grown by a side of a road, a lot of traffic, particulate matter going to put PAHs on the vegetables. So we're all carrying them in our bodies. They go through your body pretty quickly, most of them. Some of them are carcinogens, some are not. Something to pay attention to. But obviously, this is the kind of chemical we're not going to ban unless we ban the internal combustion engine. And I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But we need to find ways to protect ourselves from exposures to PAHs. Benzopyrene is carcinogen is probably one of the worst, and this is just some of the exposures listed I just mentioned, but it's important to realize that when you're fighting a fire, that a lot of PAHs are produced and into the smoke and the soot. The 321 firefighters biomonitored 3 weeks out of 9/11 were compared to a control group, and they had, the ones exposed, they had higher levels of PAHs, and there was also some higher levels of antimony and some dioxins and furans. Not really high, but a little bit high, but cause for concern for sure, but people are expecting higher exposure. So I just wanted to say a couple of things about this, is that many people think that these multiple exposures that firefighters get is what's causing the harm. It's PAHs plus this. So if you're on a fire ground, you will be exposed to PAHs, a carcinogen. You'll probably be exposed to dioxins and furans, carcinogen. You may be exposed to benzene, a carcinogen, and so on. So these things kind of build up, and they interact, and they interact in ways that we don't always know about because can't always test combinations of chemicals. I just listed a couple of examples for this. Dioxins combined with PCBs created a greater damage to livers than by dioxins alone. It's just one study out of many. Flame retardants, PCBs, and mercury, and this is an animal study, affected the brain and had a vital role in kind of damping down learning and memory in a rat. We do animal studies, we don't know human studies. Does this carry over to humans? Probably. Glutamate is a chemical we find in our brains as well. And I kind of like this study because as I get older, instead of having a senior moment, I can just say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't remember this because I have flame retardants, PCBs, and mercury in my brain, and this is what's going on. Use any excuse you can. Okay, stress. You know, there's so many studies about how stress affects the immune system that it's hard to get a grant to really study that. But it's clear that stress will affect your body by, for one thing, damping down your immune system. The kind of chemicals in your body, substances that are in there to clear out your body from cancer cells that are in your body all the time, stop working. We're talking about natural killer cells and T cells. So those stop working when you're under a lot of stress. So it's not that stress causes cancer, but it kind of opens up the door because those cancer cells are not cleared out of your body. Another study that I'm particularly interested in had to do with exposing rats to stress and to chemicals. And the result of that there were measurable changes in the brains of the rat. You could look at a slice of a rat's brain and actually see some changes, neurological damage. And the rats were stressed by exposing them to very high temperatures and constraining their movements. To me, that sounds like what happens to firefighters in your turnout suits and fighting a fire, that is something happening then that is measurable, causing some problems in how you feel and how you think. I don't know that, but the researchers that did this study were trying to explain post-traumatic stress syndrome in vets from Iraq and Gulf Storm. And I think that maybe this is one of the things that was going on. Okay, so a biomarker of exposures to PAHs. This is a really interesting study that just came out about 6 months ago. It turns out that firefighters have evidence of exposure to PAHs in the way they express a certain kind of DNA that is unique to firefighters. You don't find this in any other populations exposed to PAHs. So this is interesting because it means you can measure, you could take a look at this DNA expression by looking at the DNA itself and seeing the evidence of how this PAHs have interacted with the DNA in terms of methyl groups being attached to a part of the DNA and changing the way it works. You can distinguish a firefighter from anybody else. And the more effect there is related to how long a firefighter has been in service, not age. Now, what this happens in terms of DNA, research is going on to see what it actually means, but usually when this happens, methyl groups being attached to DNA, it makes someone more vulnerable to disease. Now, how that actually works, 1 minute. Are you kidding me? Oh, okay. All right. So I was going to tell you about flame retardants. Kathy's going to have to tell you about flame retardants.
Take two.
What?
Take two.
2 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. Flame retardants can make firefighting more dangerous. When they're burned, they produce gases. They produce a lot of soot. They produce a lot of dioxin and furans. We don't need them. We can probably get rid of them. But the effects they have are making it more difficult for our children to think. Look at cord blood of women and who've been exposed to PBDs. It's just kind of average levels. And the kids that were born that had slightly higher levels of PBDEs couldn't think as well. And these are levels of the whole population is. But I don't want you to think, and the debate should never go to the question, do we protect our kids or do we protect firefighters? That's not the question, because firefighters are also damaged by these chemicals. And just quickly, these endocrine disruptors can harm developing fetus in ways that cause effects that don't show up till much later. Cryptocortisone means undescended testicles. That's related to testicular cancer later in life. This happens to kids that are exposed in utero to PBDEs. Hypospadias is a genital malformation, means the opening at the end of the penis isn't at the end of the shaft, it's down below, requires surgery. That's all also related to utero exposures. Other things for adults for exposures to some of these flame retardants, PBDEs and tris have to do with low semen quality, diabetes, decreased sperm count, decreased testes size. So whereas there's a lot of concern about cancer, there's other diseases. There's other diseases that we need to think about, which have to do with obesity, infertility, and so on. So I think that we have to keep that in mind. We had a lot of good discussion about colon, the different kinds of cancers firefighters are exposed to. I don't think we need to go into that in detail, except it's really interesting to see what the differences are in different locations. And sometimes when you look at the differences, you can hone in and say, why that difference? Why that? Why is Massachusetts different from San Francisco in terms of what kind of cancers are showing up? And that means there may be some environmental cause that could be important. A recent study came out that you can look at. Susan Shaw was able to test 12 firefighters right after a fire, which is, and found that there were very high levels of furans, brominated furans, which is a powerful carcinogen. Only tested 12 firefighters, but this could be a place to go for more research. So I'm going to wrap up now? Okay. There are other firefighter biomonitoring studies going on, one in California. We're doing one, a lot of dust exposure going on to show that there are levels of these PBDEs in household dust, but much higher levels in fire station dust, which is quite alarming. We would be quite pleased to be involved in testing firehouse dust across the country, and if anybody's interested to do that, we would like to test your firehouse dust and find out whether you have flame retardants in it, either the old ones or the new ones, because that's going to be a very important source of exposure. And the thing about these flame retardants, unlike pHs, we can regulate them. We can get them out of the pathways and find safer substitutes, because we want to keep firefighting safe, and we think there are safer flame retardants. So in conclusion, how's this for a speed presentation? I think it's important to do biomonitoring. It tells us what's really in your body. It's not guessing, it's actual proof. These chemicals on your body here and now. It's important to do environmental monitoring, air, dust, sediment. When you do training for firefighting foam, we still find PFCs in the sediment, then the dirt, breathing that in. That's interesting. Do that and do the health exposures. What's going on? Cancer, yes, but what about these other diseases, cardiovascular? It'd be great to know what's going on and document that. But the big point I want to make is it's important to do this monitoring so we have a sense of reality and do the 10-year-long epidemiological studies. We learn a lot from that. But if we know there's exposure, if we know people are carrying it in their bodies, if we know some of these chemicals last a long time, and if we know people are getting sick, they're toxic, that's enough. That's enough, isn't it, to regulate? Isn't that enough to move to safer substitutes? So I hope that we can all find ways to work together and do some of the regulation and safe substitutes, because we make firefighting safe for you, because you are all so important. We rely on you. So thank you very much for listening to a speed presentation, and I can hardly wait to tell my mother when I get home that I said the word penis in front of a lot of very good-looking firefighters. She's going to be impressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl.
I'm sorry. It's not my fault.
Okay, just a little point of order here. Courtney Fulton from the IFF asked me to mention that if you see her on the way out, she'll scan your name tag so that you'll get the CE credit for this. She'll be at this door at the end of the session, so just a little reminder, something I didn't mention at the start here. Next up, we have Kathy Curtis, who is the Executive Director of Clean and Healthy New York, who's going to give us a little presentation on fire retardant chemicals and their hazards. So, Kathy, welcome.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you all for all that you do to protect us, keep us safe. I'm Kathy Curtis from Clean and Healthy New York, which is an organization that advances broad policy and market changes to promote safer chemicals, a sustainable economy, and a healthier world. And I also am the national coordinator for a loose collaboration of groups called the Alliance for Toxic-Free Fire Safety. And Teresa's handing out a sort of a brief synopsis of what that might mean, toxic-free fire safety. And I have a slide or two that sort of a working definition of what we mean when we say fire safety without toxic impacts. And so she can share that with you. And I would love your input. My contact information is on that handout, so I would very much welcome your thoughts about whether this meets the threshold of toxic-free fire safety or whether or not we're overlooking something important, and we value your input. But of course, there are some aspects of fire safety that we're all aware of, which is, you know, first and foremost, the excellent work of the fire service. And some of the things that are in place that only come into effect when there's a fire, like smoke detectors, sprinklers, and things of that nature that don't harm firefighters or building occupants or the environment, that only come into play when they're needed. And sprinklers are a really good example of that. I was impacted by the green aspects of sprinklers, the way they use less water, they don't release as much, allow for the release of as much toxic gas into the air, they reduce toxic runoff into the water, they reduce waste into landfills, and of course save lives, and also conserve replacement building materials and lower costs because it keeps the footprint of the fire really small compared to a fully engulfed building. But I'm mostly here to talk about health impacts and health concerns and the policies that are being advanced to minimize them. Disease prevention bills that are either passed or in play right now. And the problem with the health impacts from these flame retardants is that they are gifts that keep on giving. So if, in other words, if brain development is harmed, that's just, you know, that's the way you are for the rest of your life, you know. If you are infertile, sometimes you don't even know that until you go to have kids at the age of 32, and you can't. But it's been, you know, an impact that was from long-term exposure. Immune suppression, that's a long-term impact. Endocrine disrupting, obesogen chemicals, things that make you fat and, you know, make girls more like boys and boys more like girls. Really, that's what endocrine disrupting chemicals do in a nutshell. You know, those are lifelong consequences. And of course, cancer is also a very severe and long-term impact. There was a little study done at the University of California, Riverside that was led by Dr. David Eastman that graded 90 flame retardant chemicals using methodology similar to the Environmental Protection Agency's Design for the Environment Alternatives Assessment Program. And that rates chemicals on hazard, not on use, not on exposure, just on their inherent properties, what they do. Do they persist in the environment? Do they build up in our bodies? Are they toxic? Do they disrupt the endocrine system? Do they cause cancer? Do they pollute aquatic ecosystems, et cetera? And 90 of them, 90 of the flame retardants got a D or an F on that grading system. And, you know, it makes you ask, how do we get here? I mean, why were these chemicals approved for use to begin with? You know, didn't we think, you know, that we should prevent exposure and prevent these diseases of environmental origin? And the way we got here is through a very, very inadequate federal chemical management system that has completely failed to protect us. It's called the Toxic Substances Control Act. It's never been updated since 1976, unlike other major pieces of environmental legislation like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. When it was passed, there were 62,000 chemicals already being used that were just grandfathered right in and assumed safe at that moment, without any data, any testing, not even use information where those chemicals were found. And since then, the EPA has only been able to get adequate information on about 200 chemicals. Only 5 chemicals have been banned since the law passed in 1976. And the EPA tried to ban asbestos with just rooms and rooms, scores and scores of published studies that showed how harmful asbestos was. And they were sued, and they lost in that lawsuit. So they've given up. They haven't banned a single chemical since 1990 of the 85,000 chemicals in commerce. So it's kind of the wild, wild west out there, you know. And so the solution is to, reform this and modernize and update this ancient piece of legislation that's really sort of Jurassic legislation that's regulating space-age chemicals, because a couple thousand get introduced in the market without any pre-market safety testing every year. So what's happened with the lack of regulatory or federal protection is states are taking the lead. They're stepping up and working to protect not only their own citizens, but push for the day when create a tipping point for federal reform. And I'm sure that, a lot of these states that you're looking at, a lot of the folks in this room come from these places. And in fact, the penta and octa bans that have also been added, the DECA now has been added to them. Those are 3 kinds of PBDEs, penta, octa, and DECA BDE, created a tipping point where there's been phase-outs of production of all 3 of those chemicals nationwide. So none of those chemicals are being made anymore in the United States. It's open for question whether or not they're still being imported in the form of products inside of things that are coming into our homes and our country. But no, those chemicals are not being produced anymore in the U.S. And a lot of times they've been replaced with chemicals that are equally harmful, like chlorinated tris, which was taken out of kids' pajamas back in the 70s because it caused genetic changes. They basically tested kids before they put them to bed at night. They tested their urine and put their pajamas on and put them to bed and tested their urine again in the morning and found high levels of these chemicals already in their bodies with just one night of sleeping. And they caused genetic changes. So they took them out and it came right back into our furniture. So they're only banned in children's children's clothing, but not anywhere else. And so states have been stepping up, and they acknowledge that, so you just did this switcheroo, this whack-a-mole, where you replaced one toxic chemical for another. Okay, then we're going to work to phase them out as well and require safer substitutes. And the first bans of the nation have already occurred in Maryland, New York, and Vermont, and this is, of course, driving broader reform. So federal policy is, what's really necessary to protect people and communities and firefighters in all states, in states that don't really take these kinds of issues on, like Wyoming or Mississippi or everywhere. And so the bill that's in play right now, the Chemical Safety Improvement Act, the good news is it does have bipartisan support, so it has some legs. We've gotten, obviously, enough momentum and education on this for people to understand that reform is needed, but the bad news is it's a very weak bill. There are no deadlines in it, and we know how long governments can take to get around to finalizing regulations. There's no expedited on the worst chemicals that Cheryl talked about at the end of her presentation. Come on, we know enough about these chemicals. They've been studied to death. Let's just act. It preempts all the great work that states have done and will do in the future. It places gag orders on medical staff like EMTs that are first receivers or first responders to people who've been exposed at chemical facilities or anywhere in their community. And there's no provisions for the most impacted people. There's also a bill that deals just with the flame-retardant chemicals called the Decrease on Safe Toxins or DUST Act, introduced by a congresswoman from Connecticut, Rosa DeLauro. And we expect similar legislation in the U.S. Senate as well. Now, the Consumer Product Safety Commission is revising their upholstered furniture flammability standard, and they're leaning towards a smolder standard but are also considering aspects of an open flame or barrier as well. So that's something that would be really important for firefighters to weigh in on, to make sure that, toxic chemicals aren't necessary to achieve it, especially if it doesn't really increase fire safety. So just briefly, what's driving a lot of the use of chemicals in upholstered furniture in particular is this unique flammability standard that's out of the state of California. And what it requires is that bare foam withstand a 12-second open flame being held against it. None of us are sitting on bare foam right now. None of us sit on bare foam in our homes. What we do sit on is fabric, covering foam. So by the time the fabric lights and is ignited and there's an open flame, it's going to burn for more than 12 seconds anyway. So this is like the worst of both worlds. Polyurethane foam is so fuel-rich, it's going to burn with the amount that is added to it. And it's a high level. We're not talking parts per million here. We're talking a couple pounds of cancer-causing chemicals like tris in everybody's living room pretty much across the land. And yet, it'll still burn. You get about 3 seconds benefit out of the addition of these chemicals. So it's exposing everyone all the time. When it burns, and it does burn, it produces either hydrogen bromide gas or hydrogen chloride gas, depending on whether it's a chlorinated tris or a brominated flame retardant. And then when that hits somebody's breathing passages, it turns into hydrobromic acid or hydrochloric acid, which you'll see on the label of a can of oven cleaner or Drano, dish or drain cleaner. That's how corrosive it is. So the standard's usually met by adding chemicals, and that's not how most fires start. Most fires start from smoldering, like a cigarette being dropped. So now California is looking to revise that standard. It should be finalized by January and go into effect, which requires the cover materials, which is where the flame starts, to resist a smoldering ignition source. And a lot of the furniture that we have already meets that standard. So there's enormous opposition, naturally, to any regulation or policy that's going to restrict the use of chemicals, because it's an enormous source of income for the chemical industry. And so they're, of course, going to oppose that. And so just, to know your opposition, they created an industry front group called Citizens for Fire Safety that was so unscrupulous and reprehensible in their actions that they were exposed everywhere, and now they're defunct. They were vanquished, and exposed through the series in the Chicago Tribune that won awards for its cutting-edge journalism, and that they researched for over a year. And so now it's the North American Flame Retardant Alliance, which is really just a subset of the American Chemistry Council, who never met a chemical that they didn't like. And the NAFRA was in Vermont this year, in 2013, working to prevent the firefighters and environmental health advocates there from banning tris, but they did not succeed, thank goodness. And really, none of these laws in these states have ever been able to be achieved without support from the fire service. So that's how instrumental you guys are. So this, as I said, they are unscrupulous. They use deceptive statistics. They threaten the sky is falling with job loss. They do nothing. They have no statistics to substantiate that. They can't, nothing to evidence that. They just play on that fear. They have really deep pockets. They spent almost $3 million in just one quarter in 2013, the second quarter of 2013. Don't we wish we could throw money around like that? And get our agenda advanced in the Capitol? And they really have full-time staff who are only dedicated to getting on codes committees and task forces on flame retardant safety and all these EPA Design for the Environment Alternatives Assessment partnerships and other work groups. And they really do unduly influence their decision-making, especially if the fire service is not represented on these panels. And they use science for hire and people with big strings of alphabet soup after their name, but they really aren't science for hire. They're hired guns. Whereas people who are supporting toxic-free fire safety tend to be people that are more like us, firefighters, labor representatives, public employees, teachers, nurses, people who are affected by chemicals, cancer advocates, learning disabilities advocates, reproductive health, et cetera. And whereas we work in collaboration with firefighters, big tent, diverse coalitions We have to be unassailable, bulletproof. We can like never even make a mistake, let alone flagrantly and blatantly lie, which is what those guys, believe me, in the Capitol, that's what they do. And we show evidence that this is a problem through product testing, biomonitoring, as Cheryl described, to show why reform is necessary. And we point to solutions, how people are achieving fire safety without the use of toxic chemicals. So the problem, though, is we're at a severe disadvantage for two reasons. We're outfunded, and they lie like rugs. So, how do you fight that? It makes it hard. Anyway, so there's a couple new studies I just wanted to touch on. This one tested 100 chunks of foam from couches already in people's houses. They didn't go out and buy new ones. So they're all different ages. And they found that 85% of them contain toxic or untested chemicals that we don't know anything about. And 41% of them contained that tris chemical that they took out of PJs and threw right back into foam. People have no way of knowing. You can have two couches right next to each other in the store. You'd never know by looking at them which one contained a couple pounds of a cancer-causing chemical and which one didn't. But almost all of them, with that California Technical Bulletin label, have them. Unfortunately, though, about 60-something% of the ones that don't have the Technical Bulletin 117 label also have the chemicals in them. And then they test nap mats, which are what kids lay on when they take naps in child care centers. And the reason all these different things, push-up bras, padded toilet seats, anything with foam, because that's where they add the chemicals, when they make the foam, not when they make the final product. So they're in all kinds of things that don't need to be inflammable. They don't need to be flame retarded. A nursing pillow for an infant, why? So plenty of alternatives too for the nap mats: polyester, fiberfill, cotton, wool. And there's also an upcoming biomonitoring study that Dr. Shaw here is going to be conducting that brings together chemical exposure and health outcomes in New York firefighters and Maine firefighters, which is important to make that link. And there's a quote here from the Pres: connection between firefighting and cancer is real. So we have to prevent those diseases. There's a lot that we can all do to protect ourselves, to get involved with others who are like-minded, to educate our peers, and to challenge product makers, demand innovation in this area, demand less flammable but healthier products, because there's always somebody that wants to meet a demand in the marketplace. That's what's the beauty of capitalism, really, is if you build a better mousetrap, they're going to be a path to your door. So if we demonstrate that demand, somebody's going to come up with that innovation, and in order to have a healthy business. So, and also get involved in those decision-making bodies that are making decisions that directly affect our health, and make sure that the firefighter voice is represented. So just to conclude, there is a broad scientific consensus that shows both the ineffectiveness, especially in foam, of these added chemicals, and outlines the harms to the environment and to human beings. And there's a lot of ways to achieve fire safety without using flame retardants, chemicals, and yet it's all about the money. They sit on these 3 major bromine deposits around the country, around the world, and they intend to wring every single nickel out of them that they possibly can. But in spite of that, policies are spreading to regulate toxic flame retardants and promote and incentivize those alternatives. So together we can win toxic-free fire safety. And thank you again for all that you do and for coming to hear our talk today.
We'll have a question and answer series session at the end after the last speaker, which would be me. We'll try to wrap that up about 10 minutes till 5 at the end of the session. So next up, I'm going to introduce Dr. James Melius, occupational physician and epidemiologist and chairman of the Iaff Medical Advisory Board. So find your presentation here. You're ready.
Okay. I don't think I'll start with a conclusion. though it is late on a Saturday afternoon, so yeah.
That's right.
We can vote on it or something. All right.
Need my nap.
I was talking to Dennis Sweeney before, from somebody I know from New York, and we were kidding that, there's gotta be, how many fire departments you have, you know, a non-fabric covered foam couch, chair, or piece of apparatus in the seat? There's gotta be a lot of that around, so, it's not, maybe not in people's homes, but I'm sure, sure there's some examples like that. Yeah, I've worked with the IFF a long time, and longer than I'd like to admit, but and want to admit. But we're so what I'm going to talk about is sort of to complement what's already been said, and to sort of introduce what, in some ways, what Brian will follow up with in terms of preventive issues. So I want to sort of fairly quickly go through a little bit on sort of toxic fire environment in a very general sense. So it's sort of talking about the old hazards we've known about a long time. What new information, new science is there on those old hazards? Because those are still probably the major exposures responsible for most of the illness that occurs or may occur among firefighters. How are some of these hazards changing? And I think the previous two speakers have talked about that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on repeating what they said. I think it is important, and it's important we pay attention to sort of new hazards and so forth, but it is our old hazards are just as important, or hazards we've known about before. Again, you must have had this thousands of times, and it just sort of, again, it's important to remember how are you exposed to hazards from fire smoke. You inhale it, okay, gets on your clothing, skin, protective equipment, and you can absorb it through your skin. And that's probably more important, particularly important for some of the chlorinated, brominated compounds we're talking that were mentioned earlier. But it's for many other chemicals also, and I don't think it's something we've paid probably as much attention to before in terms of prevention. And you can also ingest, you swallow, some of that smoke and soot and so forth. And I think the cancer study, for those of you that attended that, or one of the findings of an increased risk of digestive cancer sort of, brings to, at least sort of underscores the need to remember that can be an important source of exposure. Also, and may be responsible for some of the exposure and some of the health effects that firefighters may experience. Okay, the fire environment is very complex, and one of the earlier speakers talked about, well, now we can detect 5,000 chemicals in the human body. Well, there are many, many more chemicals than that in fire smoke. It's some are detected. You can find studies, but usually almost any study of fire smoke is sort of at the limits of the capability of chemistry to detect and identify those chemicals. And so there's a lot may never know about what's in it, and certainly it's far, what we do know is in fire smoke is far beyond what we know about even animal toxicity, let alone human health effects of many of these materials. So it's important to keep that in mind. It's also an environment that changes over time. You have the overhaul phase, early phases of the fire. It can, depending on the nature of the fire and how it spreads, you can have significant changes in what the components of that fire smoke is. And in most situations, it's very difficult to identify what are the sources of any specific exposure. You're dealing with this mixture, and there's not enough information or science or ways of measuring, at least in real time, to be able to either identify all the important sources or predict what the levels of exposure may be. So you have to assume the worst in most cases. And you have to do that in terms of, there are other hazards to be concerned about and other dangers. So it's not your only concern in terms of protecting your health is not just what you may breathe in. It's what else may happen to you and what else may go on at the fire scene to that. There's some, new, better science, and some of that's been presented here, and maybe not from this perspective, but but some of the work from underwriters, and some of the other exposure studies going on that, again, do a little bit more at identifying what some of those sources may be, not necessarily what they are in specific fires, but what may be and where different chemicals may come from, and I'll go through that in a second. But sort of the bottom line is that, the smokier a fire is and the more smoke that's being generated, more likely it is to have more toxic materials in it also. And so, I think it's follow up. And a corollary to that is even if it looks okay, doesn't look very smoky, doesn't appear to be bad, it may still be bad from the perspective of toxic exposures. So you have to, sort of assume the worst most of the time. And I think it's funny. I've been coming to these sessions for years and doing other work with the fire service, and we always talk about how bad car fires are and so forth. And there was actually very little data on that, and somebody, I think it's underwriters, has recently done a study looking at a tire fire. Yeah, it's bad, okay. So we finally know that most of you, if not all of you, haven't assumed and known for years and so forth. So we're underscoring that, but now we know a little bit more why it's bad, but it really doesn't, I don't think, change how one should approach it and what's going on. So again, I'm not going to go into detail on all these. We know some of the major problems. Carbon monoxide, about hydrogen cyanide, it's very high in some fires, not high in others, and difficult to predict. When I was first coming to these Redmond Symposium over 30 years ago, there were projects trying to better identify which fires had cyanide and some autopsy follow-up on fire victims and so forth. And we really still can't predict that very well. Polyaromatic hydrocarbons, polynuclear aromatic compounds, the PAHs, are a significant source of exposure. That's what's in soot. Again, those are multiple chemicals. It's been talked about a little earlier there. Again, tying it back to the NIOSH cancer study, what causes bladder cancer, what can be cause of digestive cancer and other cancers are PAHs. So if there's something that, is linked back to that and responsible, it is probably the PAH exposure. And again, that's been around, it's nothing new. Maybe we can measure it better, understand it a little bit better, but not completely. Hydrochloric acid, aldehydes, and a huge range of organic compounds, some of which have been talked about here, but I won't go into. There is some of the new science coming out, new studies coming out, sort of confirm, again, I think what everybody knew is that synthetic materials, when they burn, produce more smoke and produce more toxic materials in that smoke. And you can, see a difference between an ordinary wood structure fire and a fire where there's a greater load of various synthetic materials in that. There's some specificity to what is found in what chemicals or toxic chemicals are found in higher amounts in these fires. But again, it's not always predictive, and as you know, most fires are a mixture of different materials. So from wood fires, there's more formaldehyde and hydrogen cyanide produced, but still a significant amount of benzene. Styrene products, benzene, phenols, polyvinyl products, hydrochloric acid, cyanide, benzene. PAHs from all of those, so that's ubiquitous, carbon monoxide and so forth also. One of the things we are have a better understanding of in terms of health effects and how it may be related to fire smoke is we're now doing a better science on being able to measure smaller particles in the air. And so the scientific term, we refer to these as ultrafine materials, sometimes also as nanoparticles. Again, very, very small, less than the human eye can see particles. And when those are measured, when fire smoke is measured, 99% of the particulate in fire smoke are these ultrafines. And that's important because the ultrafines can go, the smaller the particle generally, the deeper it goes into your lung. And the ultrafines also produce some more surface area for chemicals to be absorbed on. And so one of the ways that chemicals from the fire, the PAHs, so many of the other organic chemicals, most likely the flame retardants and so forth that were talked about up here, would you would inhale them, would be through them on, essentially absorbing onto the surface of an ultrafine small particle. And so that probably explains several things. One is it not in addition to how some of the chemicals get in that may cause cancer and other health effects, it also probably explains why fire smoke is so such an important cause of respiratory disease. And before there were SCBAs, a lot of the lung disease that occurred among respiratory disease among firefighters are probably best explained by these smaller ultrafine particulate. A lot of that's been controlled by SCBA use. But heart disease is also, we know from other studies, not of firefighters, but others, related to exposures to ultrafines. And again, special situation in the World Trade Center where we had huge amounts of very small particulate. What did we see? We saw fibrotic and other lung disease. We saw, at least starting to see in some of the studies, increased in heart disease also, and cancer on top of that. One other thing I think that comes out of some of the newer exposure studies is that there's really no single indicator of what's a bad fire. So measuring carbon monoxide, which has been done, and others, to try to have an indicator for when you need to be more concerned or use increased protection. It just doesn't, the fire environment is too complex to be able to do that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's already been covered, but one of the other new hazards that hasn't been talked about, and I want to mention partly because I do a fair amount of my work now in the construction industry, but in addition to ultrafine particles or nanoparticles that can be produced from diesel exhaust or from fire smoke, there's also engineered nanomaterials that are being widely introduced into building materials. They're being introduced into cosmetics. They're being introduced into all sorts of, actually into medications also, and ways of delivering medications and so forth. And these, those I think particularly in building materials are where firefighters need to be concerned. Again, not a lot of studies of these. They're not almost totally unregulated at this point in time. Starting to see some regulation in Europe, but none yet in the United States. There's a little bit of testing on that, and particularly in some of them, for example, the carbon nanotubules, certain types of those cause some of the same health effects in animals as do asbestos in terms of the lung fibrosis and the mesothelioma types of cancer. So we know that those around, again, it's what you've seen with other synthetic materials. You get them introduced into the environment and commerce and widely used, or the flame retardants we talked about. There may not be a lot of concern or health effects now, but what are you going to experience 20 years from now? And so again, like the flame retardants and other chemicals, we need to start paying more attention to those and do that. So in conclusion, sort of ran through this fairly briefly, but yeah, we know fire smoke is toxic. You don't have to have a special fire or something exotic and hazardous materials fire to do that. All fire smoke contains toxic chemicals that can cause lung disease, heart disease, and cancer, among other things. That as more synthetic materials get introduced into our built environment, so to speak, when that built environment and materials, cars and so forth burn, your exposures are going to get worse, more toxic. And again, we need to do some of the follow-up on in terms of preventing new toxic chemicals getting more widely used. But meanwhile, we need to follow sort of universal protection and do everything we can to protect you while you're fighting all fires. And I think this will sort of be a lead-in to Brian's talk, who's going to talk about some of the steps that his fire department's taken and so forth to prevent exposures, including, which I was very impressed with, your steps on cleaning uniforms and so forth. So go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Melius. Like many of you, we've had more deaths on the Phoenix Fire Department from cancer as well as suicides over the last few years. And we have 2 members right now that are very seriously ill who've been battling cancer. We had a young former member pass away a few months ago. And one close to me, I'd kind of like to dedicate my talk to today, to Don Mills, longtime decorated, probably the most decorated fire engineer in the city of Phoenix. He's 75 years old, lived the job, probably had 50 years in total fire service, counting his time in Massachusetts before he joined the Phoenix Fire Department, where he served, I believe, about 48 years on the job in the Phoenix Fire Department. Retired about 6 years ago. And then was diagnosed with cancer. And I'll tell you about one of the things that we have as far as our cancer presumptive law that is a problem. So, Don Mills is who I, like to, dedicate my presentation to. Talk about limiting exposures. We're really challenged. We really don't have our arm around this in the fire service. We're doing a lot better. What I'm going to give you is a perspective from what we've done in Phoenix. It's certainly not the best. Some of you may do it better. Some of you may provide me with some additional ideas on things that you're doing that we could do. But I was asked to kind of share some of the things that we're doing there. As you know, atmospheric monitoring is really difficult. We don't know what's in the atmosphere other than the scientific studies that have been done that show that, the chemical compounds and presence of airborne particulates are certainly carcinogenic. We do a really good job at monitoring hazmat incidents. We set up our hot zones, our warm zones, and our cold zones, and we use a multitude of different atmospheric monitoring devices on those situations. In Phoenix, we used to monitor for carbon monoxide. We thought for a long time that was the standard by which we could remove our Scba, and the threshold was the, I believe it was the OSHA limit of 50 parts per million when we said, hey, it's safe to remove your Scba. We no longer monitor for CO for a few reasons. Number one, we participated in a study in 1998 with the University of Arizona, and it's been cited and talked about, where we sent hazmat techs out to working fires, and what they did was used a filter canister to draw in the atmospheric air, and it was analyzed, and you heard that there's a number of things that were found: benzenes, aldehydes, 1,3-butadiene, and a number of other things such as acrolein and so forth. So we found out that why monitor for CO when there's more significant hazards present that we can't even detect. There's no direct read monitor available, atmospheric monitor available. I'm a hazmat tech, and we've got the latest in hazmat techs. Probably the closest is the Smith's Gas ID, but it's really impractical to use on your average room and contents fire or structure fire. So someday down the road there may be that technology available, but it doesn't exist yet. So what we have to do is kind of put some policies in place and engineering controls and practices. And one of them we have is our Scba policy. And we instruct our folks to avoid premature removal. I tell you what, it's like other warm climates in the country, and we're a little bit warmer than some places. On a 110-degree day, that's the first thing I want to get off after we've got the fire under control, and we've got knocked down and gotten a chance to go outside and take a break. But that's one of the challenges to, premature removal while we go back inside for overhaul. Our policy also references be aware of smoldering materials. As Dr. Melius said, 99% of smoke particles you can't even see with your eyes, so it may look like it's a clear atmosphere, but those toxins are still present. We also advocate in that Scba policy that you should change the atmospheric conditions, and one of the ways that we can do is set up a PPV fan and blow fresh air in, and the environment that we're working, at least we have a much higher concentration of fresh air than if we didn't have a fan set up. Routine situations, company officer usually is the decision maker, but if we're operating at a bigger incident where we say have multiple sector officers, and sometimes sector officers, when there's multiple different companies operating, our battalion chiefs working in forward positions, removal may be in conjunction with them. Here's a hard to read copy of our Scba policy, but it's a couple pages and just kind of outlines the things that I just talked to you about. If some of you'd like a copy of that, just see me afterwards, and or my contact information is in the abstract, so you can get a hold of me, and I can get a PDF copy sent out to you. Another way that we try to limit our exposures is on-scene decon. That's kind of been a big factor that we've talked about and you've heard throughout some of the presentations this week. With hose lines as well as compressed air. On scene, our engineers usually hook up a compressed air line to the jack on the truck, put on a dust mask, and use a compressed air to remove contaminants from the turnouts and so forth, as well as using the jump line or the red line or whatever you guys might call it to do a gross decon of any kind of particles that are on the turnouts in Scba. And then gear laundering. We're really fortunate that we have a good gear laundering program in Phoenix. We have a pretty good system in place where we have firefighter trainees that are called red shirts, and we got about 7 of them, and they're typically the pre-recruits or recruits that will go into the next academy class, and they work a 40-hour week delivering supplies, commodities, other items to our stations, and they're the ones that pick up our turnout gear. And what we're told is in our policy is that after fire contaminated turnout gear, you bag it up at the end of the shift in a plastic bag. Include your hood, include your gloves, and that's another thing. Our necks and ears and our face are highly vascular areas, and if you're not keeping your hood clean and getting that washed, that very well could be a source of exposure through those highly vascular areas. So we advocate that you get your hood clean. One of the things I hadn't even really thought about that I learned about here was the sweat band on your helmet. That how do you clean and decontaminate that? And I'm probably one of the biggest offenders of that, because I've never really thought about doing that, but it certainly makes a lot of sense to do so. But we're real fortunate also in Phoenix is that we have 2 sets of turnout gear, and the only reason we have 2 sets of turnout gear is not for exposure protection. It just so happened over time, as we had recruits come on over the last 15 years, we have ladder tenders. It's a small version of a ladder truck, just doesn't have the aerial stick on it, and we're supposed to use it as a separate truck for EMS calls, fire situations, or auto extrications, those sorts of things. It carries duplicate sets of tools on it, and so when we implemented that concept about 20 years ago or longer, they issued 2 sets of turnout to folks assigned to ladder companies, so there wouldn't be that delay moving stuff from one truck to the other. So I'd like to say that we got 2 sets of turnout gear, that it doesn't say it was an exposure issue. It really wasn't. It was a practical, functional issue for folks in the station. But we're at the point now where everybody has a second set of turnout because of that system. So most folks, with their second set of turnout, you take your dirty turnouts, you bag them up, you wear your clean turnouts the rest of the shift if you don't get a fire, and you send it down to our resource management section, which is a big warehouse and where all of our supplies are delivered from and where our trucks are maintained. We have some commercial laundry machines as well as dryers. The stuff gets clean, your turnouts get clean. There's air dryers that have been set up. It's really important we follow the manufacturer instructions because they're pretty specific. If for following them, it involves no heat. We used to hang them up years ago out in the sun because in Arizona the humidity is really, really low. Stuff dries quick. I worked in Ohio, started my career in Ohio, where your stuff would stay wet all summer long. But in Arizona, you can hang your stuff on the bay on the side of the turnout truck after coming back from a call, and it's dry in 20 minutes. But anyway, so we do all our stuff on the inside now, drying with no heat. We also have a glove dryer, so you can send your gloves in and get them clean. Most of our stuff gets named, so this machine actually was version 2 of this device. So, and then Hoot Gibson was a longtime deputy chief with our fire department who was there when this was implemented, and Hoot was known to tell a lot of stories, so they thought, well, we're going to name a piece of equipment after you. So Hoot's hot air machine has served long after he's retired, so very effective. One of the other things, bagging our turnout gear and sending it in, there's folks that inspect it. You know, they look for tears, any kind of damage, and it's not too unusual for folks to come back to work the next shift, at the start of the next shift, and find out you have a bag of brand new turnout gear because your stuff was condemned when you sent it in. This is also kind of an employee responsibility, and our firefighters are no different than anywhere else. Our middle and last name is the same as every other fire department in the country. You know, our first name is Phoenix, but, you know, just like everybody else out there, we have the same types of folks, same folks that do the job, and, you know, folks that don't want to get their gear cleaned up. So sometimes what happens is that you know, when it finally does get sent in, because it's so dirty, it does get condemned, and they get a little bit upset. So we, as company officers, encourage everybody to bag up their gear and send it in, and it comes back, you know, by the next shift. And it's a good system and works really well, and we're fortunate about that. Other things we use to limit exposures is gear storage. I'll show you kind of what we have for our gear storage facilities here in just a minute. Discourage turnouts in living quarters, where it used to be pretty free years ago to kind of walk in, sit down, and sit in those foam-covered chairs and eat with your turnouts on, your bunker pants. Peer pressure, company officer enforcement is a big one to, you know, reduce exposures. And then reminders through labels and signs. So here's one of our newest stations. They're all built now. The newer ones are all built with separate closets or rooms that have a ventilation system and these cages that allow for drying of the gear, and no other items are stored in this room. You know, doors shut. So this is one of our newer stations. The station I'm at is an older station, so we got a Conex box or one of those mobile mini boxes out back that have those same racks in there. So we try to, you know, we have older stations too, and we have to adjust similarly. Reminders on doors, you know, that say, hey, don't work your gear in, you know, limit exposures in that manner. Now, as you all know, we're going to have exposures. You know, for as long as I can see, we're never going to be able to get our arm around this issue of reducing the exposures that we have to reduce our cancer, you know, rates. So we do have in a number of states cancer presumptive laws, and they require reporting and collection of data and information that says that you were exposed to incidents. We're no different than anybody else, as I said before. And so how many of you have had problems with exposure reporting in your departments? Come on, be honest, we're all family. Okay. All right. You come back from a car fire at 4 in the morning, the last thing you want to do if you've been up all night is fill out an exposure form, even though you absorbed a lot of smoke, you know, through dermal aspects. And so the last thing you want to do is fill out your paperwork. Even when you get up at shift change to leave the station, you may have to pick up kids and so forth, and you don't have the time, so it doesn't happen. Unfortunately, in Arizona, we have to have documentation for in order to be approved for the cancer presumption law. So we found a lot of guys were missing paperwork in their files. So we had to come up with some other kind of system. I'm going to touch briefly here on what we have in Arizona for our cancer presumption law, and then go into some of the problems and how we kind of address that. We have 7 different cancers. You know, listening to the presentations and also reading some of the studies and reports, we would like to see prostate and testicular cancer added at a minimum, especially prostate. We've had a big issue of that over the last few years in the Phoenix Fire Department. But however, we're challenged, like a lot of folks are in most states, that our legislature really doesn't want to implement any additional regulatory issues that could cost the city's money. But we're going to look for that opportunity and try to make that happen in the future. I know that, you know, some folks out there, some brothers and sisters, don't have any kind of cancer presumptive law. So my hope is that it's someday you folks will be successful in getting something like this implemented. Some folks out there have better cancer presumptive laws. So someday we hope to get those additional cancers in our law in Arizona. just a few of the basics. You can't have any cancer present or have a history of it at time of hire in your pre-hire physical. You have to have 5 years of hazardous duty. And one of the other stipulations too with the cancer presumptive law that affects some of our members, including the one I spoke to you about at the beginning of my presentation, is that you have to be 65 years of age or younger if you are retired. So if you retire at 68, as Don Mills did, and now he's 75 and got diagnosed with, essentially a series of cancers that would have fallen under the cancer presumptive law, but he didn't qualify for it. And he had exposures his entire career on the Phoenix Fire Department. But that's one of the other problems and other things we want to address. Plus, you have to have some kind of a record of exposure and department notification. So what we had is a few years ago, I had a guy come up to me about 3 years ago and said, and this is a call I get far too often, they say, hey, Brian, I've just been diagnosed with cancer. I say, I'm sorry about your diagnosis, what kind of cancer it is. Guy tells me it's non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I say, well, bad news is you got cancer. Good news is it falls under one of the Arizona cancer presumptive laws. So I say, here's your next step. And incidentally, I told this guy all the things he needed to do, and he was clearly lucid and aware and talked and replied back to me everything that I told him. So I'll get to the rest of that story here in just a second. But first of all, I told him to go down to the Fire Department Health Center and said, look in your exposure file and get your exposure forms out of there. Well, I get a phone call back within 24 hours, is typically the case from him, and what do you think he told me? There's nothing there. Now, this guy had over 30 years on the job. He worked on busy fire companies. He never promoted to beyond firefighter. Excellent firefighter, went to a lot of fires. But he also came on the job in the 70s when we didn't really have computer records. So I go, wow, this is a difficult one. I said, the only way we're going to be able to overcome this, and I haven't tried this one yet, is go back and find all the logbooks of the companies that you worked at. And that, because I looked at the state law, and the state law says all you got to do is have some kind of record, essentially, that you went to fires, and you have to have examples of fires. So he worked really hard. He came out and had 300 pages of logbook, 300 logbook pages from different companies that he worked at that he used as his example of fires that he'd been to. And he was successful. So I was really happy for that, because we had an urban legend and an urban myth in Phoenix that was perpetuated by well-intended chiefs on our department that said you can never file an exposure claim under the cancer presumptive law if you don't have an exposure form. Well, we killed that myth, and I was really happy to do that, but that worked. One of the other things with this guy that I want to tell you about is when I meet with our members and I tell them all the stuff they need to do, I make sure they have a spouse with them, or they have whoever their significant other is, because these folks, even though they may be, alert and oriented times 4 is what we say is a paramedic, and clearly, understanding of the information you give them, you're giving them a lot of detailed information, and the stuff wasn't getting done. And with our claims and some of our benefits, they're time sensitive. So what I do from now on is I created a cancer checklist. So I meet with a guy, I meet with his wife, and I make sure that they understand everything that needs to be done, at least the spouse does, because of the important time frame. So if you want a copy of that too, I'd be happy to pass that on to you as well. So anyway, yes, sir.
So, Brian, do you think just logging into your journal after any exposure like that, like a fire, all company members were exposed to products of combustion and severe wetting from water? That's what I've done as a company officer for years, and that's what one of the old members taught me. And I don't know how well, because we don't have a great exposure in San Francisco reporting system either. And you've got to go back and go through the journals over your career and pull that out. Do you think that's a worthwhile practice, or am I just writing too much ink in that journal?
Well, I guess it depends on what if you have it in your state law, what's required for documentation to prove in a cancer claim or to obtain any kind of benefits, that may work. In this particular case, we had no other option. And in our log books, it just said, hey, went to a working structure fire, it named the trucks that were in there, used SCBAs, 4 or 5 SCBAs, and, attack lines, whatever else they did there. And that's what he used They didn't list in there, I breathed in smoke, I had absorption of smoke through my skin. That wasn't in there, but it worked in this particular case for this guy. And some of our, I don't want to call them, I guess I'll call them our more senior guys who had exposures earlier on in their career who are still on the job in the 60s and 70s, that's some of the things that we have to do for them when they were in those positions, go back to logbooks. But we're real fortunate that we're now primarily computer-based with a CAD, computer-aided dispatch system. So we had to come up with some other system that captured our exposures. And I told you, the 4 in the morning thing wasn't working, sitting down and filling out paperwork. Now our department still wants us to fill out paperwork, and our members still fill out paperwork when they can and at some point. But I found a system that's working really well for us right now. And we took our computer-aided dispatch system and we created a new mask. And it's based upon our MCTs. We enter an electronic roster of all the folks assigned to the apparatus every morning. So this was already in here. The other good thing is our system works about 99% of the time, our computer-aided dispatch system. It works so well that our map skills have deteriorated. When we have to go to a regular map book, our skills are so deficient in using a map book because this system is so dependable. So that tells you a little bit about it. But anyway, the roster goes in the morning. You get dispatched to a house fire. This is a typical house fire response with the companies. So this is what we get on our MCT. So when you finish up the incident, you're ready to go back and service or go back and clean up. Before you can go available, text comes up and says, were any crew members exposed? And so you actually have to physically hit yes or no before you can put your truck back in service. And so let's say that, yeah, hey, we were at a working fire, car fire, structure fire, whatever it may be. Next thing you do is you hit this little mask button, and this exposure mask screen that we created comes up. Remember, it already has everybody's name into it because you already entered it in the morning. And then on the right-hand side, if you take a look, it says exposed on the right-hand side, and you have to physically hit that button, yes or no. And then the next thing, we created a little drop-down menu, and I created these items on the drop-down menu based upon what I found at the time a few years ago, some of the correlations between our presumptive cancers and things that burned, and asbestos, carpeting, hydrocarbons, paint, solvents, insulation. There's other, then there's plastics, rubber materials, and compounds, upholstery, and wood products. Those are what we started with and that we still have in the system. So now what our members can do is they just select one of those items on the drop-down menu or more than one, and then at the bottom there's a little comment section that they can write additional items. One of the problems we have is that we have a tendency of guys, sometimes firefighters, sometimes get lazy and doing really simple, easy things. And they'll have a tendency to put down other, and then they'll write in all products of combustion at the bottom. I say, yeah, you can do that now and then, but at least be specific. There had to have been some rubber burn in there. There had to have been some plastics burn in there. So make sure that at least, you select some of those items. Don't write on every call other and then all products of combustion, just to protect yourself. So just something else we learned from in our process. So you can add some comments and then you send it and then it goes into a database. So what I can do is when something happens to me or I go in for my annual fire department physical, and we're fortunate that we got annual physicals through a health center, is the doctor will print out a list of all the fires that you went to that this was submitted on now. So now we've captured those incidents that we never did before. Because like I said, what was the problem? Guy called me back and said, there's nothing in my file. Well, we fixed that one, and I slayed an urban myth in the meantime, too. So that was good. So how do we limit exposures in Phoenix? It starts in the training academy. We probably spend more time talking to our recruits about the dangers and long-term hazards in the fire service than we did in years past. We also conduct the IFF Hazmat FRO class, First Responder Operations class, for Hazmat for our recruits. So I'm an IFF Hazmat instructor. That's a shameless plug for the great program too. There's some great material in that. Our Scba policy I talked about, we continually revisit that and reinforce that. Periodic reemphasis on the bad things that are out there in smoke. And we put out in our fire department weekly newsletter, hey, here's some of the things that are in smoke, be aware of it, just to keep folks thinking about it. The exposure notifications and follow-ups I told you as far as notifying folks. If you submit one of those by one of those mass by MCT, you get an automatic email generated that says, hey, you were on a fire, you reported an exposure, fill out the long exposure form. Well, we probably got maybe 40, 50% compliance on that one. So those are still, we still advocate to fill those out, but at least, like I said before, we captured that, initial fire scene exposure. Peer pressure is very important. That's another very successful way of limiting exposures. And of course, company officer is the key with all of that. We tell our guys why, when they ask why. Well, here's what we say. After long and successful career as a firefighter, unfortunately in Arizona, we have the DROP, Deferred Retirement Option Plan. And at the end of the fiscal year or the end of the calendar year when most of our guys retire and they're leaving the DROP program, the Dunbar Armored truck shows up to haul your money, your loot out that you get to go and live on and enjoy your long and happy retirement. So that's what we tell these guys to live for. And this is actually in front of our Phoenix Fire Administration, so I like to use it as like a little talk when I talk to those guys about, hey, this is the benefits of following all this stuff, what can happen long term. So that's it for me.